Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
What is a self-fulfilling prophecy? I don't need an example, I mean a definition.
You predict your own future or something.
You predict your own future, absolutely, but there is an element to a self-fulfilling prophecy that is more than just, I am the self who prophesied. A self-fulfilling prophecy,
It gets fulfilled in your life.
not that it gets fulfilled in your life, it gets fulfilled because the prophecy itself was uttered. A self-fulfilling prophecy is a prophecy that, had it not been given, the events would never have taken place that lead to its fulfillment. Let me give you a very famous example. This is a Jewish story, as well as a Muslim story, as well as a Christian story. It's a story that has been taken, I believe, also in Hinduism and Buddhism, and used in many different traditions around the world because it's just that good. This is a slightly abbreviated version for the sake of time. It happened once long ago in the days of yore, because such stories always do, that Mr. Plony, John Doe, insert name here, was wandering through the shuk, the marketplace of Jerusalem. And as he goes through the marketplace of Jerusalem, he feels a cold shadow pass over him. And he turns, and suddenly there he is, face to face with death himself, the Grim Reaper. Very appropriate for Halloween season. Cowl, bones, scythe. He is startled. But the strange thing is, death, although lacking facial features, appears equally startled. And he looks at him and he says, "Mr. Plony?" Well, Mr. Plony doesn't wait to see what the conversation is going to be about. He knows that staring death in the face is not the kind of thing he would like to repeat. And so he quickly runs out of the city, he hires a donkey, and he sets off as fast as he can get, going all the way up to Tiberias before the next day, riding his donkey like a madman. He gets to Tiberias and he thinks, at last I have put death behind me. And yet, as he walks through the gates of Tiberias, who does he see? Death, of course. And Death looks at him and says, when I saw you in Jerusalem, I was worried you wouldn't make it here in time for our appointment. The idea, of course, being that if Mr. Plony had simply stayed put in Jerusalem, he would have avoided death. But because he saw death, he wanted to run from death, and in the process, he caused his death. That is the textbook definition of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That if the events had not transpired, then the ultimate end also would have not transpired. But of course, once you began down that road, you became the agent of their fulfillment, rather than merely a pawn of fate or destiny. We see a self-fulfilling prophecy in this week's Torah portion of Lecha. We get lots of prophecies, but there's one that's very important because it is a prophecy that was not prophesied by God, and yet it is one that comes true, and it is one that has a very important lesson for it. Now, God is busy giving all sorts of promises and blessings to Avram, later to be known as Abraham. But in the midst, just shortly after the chapter begins, a famine strikes the land of Canaan, the land that Avram and Sarai have just recently come to. And what is it that Avram decides to do? We need to go somewhere where there's food, right? I mean, you can't just sit around in the country starving to death. And so they decide to go down to the breadbasket of the ancient Near East, the other side of the Fertile Crescent, since he wasn't going back to Haran, Egypt. But as he goes down into Egypt, Avram makes a prophecy. The people of Egypt are wicked. The people of Egypt will see the beauty of my wife, and they will murder me and take her for their own. So, in order to avoid any trouble, what does he do? Call me your brother. Act like you're my sister. That way we won't have any trouble when we go to Egypt. No sooner do they cross the border than indeed they notice how beautiful she is, and since she's only somebody's sister, she is whisked away to the court of Pharaoh, and numerous plagues begin to happen, And Pharaoh comes to Avram. And what does Pharaoh say? Why didn't you tell me that this was your wife? Why did you act like this was your sister? And what was Avram's answer? I didn't want to cause any trouble. I knew there might be problems. Funny enough how there became problems, because he chose to lie while standing at the border of Egypt. Had Avram simply gone to Egypt and just come among the other refugees that would have been coming there looking for food, there is no reason to believe that the Egyptians would have necessarily treated him and Sarai any differently than the other refugees coming across that border. But because he went through the steps of subterfuge, trying to get his wife to lie, he actually primed the situation so that there could be the potential for Sarai to be abducted, taken, possibly even mishandled, and for all of the catastrophes that could have unfolded. Avram messed up. He messed up because he had a preconceived notion about who the Egyptians would be. He had never been to Egypt. He just arrived a little while ago in Canaan. And he arrived from the north, not the south. But he heard rumors about the Egyptians. He was suspicious of the Egyptians. You never know what those Egyptians are like. Egyptian men, yes, they're all terrible, lecherous. Got to be careful around them. And so what did he do? He took steps that showed his fear, that showed his suspicion, that sowed the opportunity for calamity to take place. Had he just said, you know what? I've heard rumors about Egyptians, but I've never met one. Why should I assume that they're all terrible? Well, go. If there is a problem, well, hasn't God said that he will protect me? If there is a problem, can't I trust that I will find some way to get out of this for myself, for my family, and others? Why begin with mistrust? Why begin with suspicion? They can earn my mistrust and suspicion if they behave badly. But in the meantime, I will go in with an openness, with a willingness to see who they are. Now, unfortunately, Avram did not learn this lesson, because later on, there was another famine. He ends up going into the territory of Abimelech. And what does he do? The exact same thing again. He again tries to pass off Sarah as a sister, and again she is taken to Abimelech, and again all sorts of problems happen because of this. And Abimelech comes back to him again and says, why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? What kind of people do you think we are? And Avram again is abashed. But has he learned his lesson? Unfortunately not. Because when we see his son Isaac, who certainly learned from his father a thing or two, having been born after the second episode, when Isaac too has a problem and ends up again in a foreign land, what does he say to Rivka? Pretend to be my sister. It is the same pattern again. Now, academics and biblical scholars like to argue that that just means this was a standard motif among the ancient oral traditions of the Near Eastern people. The wife-sister story was an archetype that would be reworked for different legendary figures. Interesting, it's nice. But why would the Torah tell us this story 3 times? In order to show us that this has become a hereditary prophecy, that it is being taught generation to generation, and that has to stop. That in order to actually be at peace among other people, which the Jewish people will for a large portion of their life be among, we need to not be listening to rumors, not be suspicious, not be wringing our hands over how terrible they must really be. Their bestial souls will surely rise within them and have them steal our women folk away. Instead, we have to look at them as being human. We have to recognize that they are flawed, just as we are flawed. They have potential for good as well as potential for bad. But it is ultimately going to be up not to our suspicion and paranoia, but up to our trust and cohesion as a community to be able to survive any of the ordeals we might face. And if we rely too much on our paranoia and suspicion, then we might find out that we are creating the very conditions that will lead to a calamity. We might find that we are running to meet our destiny when we should stay still and be at peace. Shabbat Shalom.